Well, it's just wonderful to have Brandy Schillace with us here today and again tomorrow. She'll be joining our students from 11:30 to 12:30 tomorrow, so please join us at that event if you're a student and even if you're not. And she joined our faculty and our administrators today from 1 to 2 o'clock, and I tell you what, that was a thrilling conversation. The events over today and tomorrow are sponsored by our College of Arts and Sciences, our College of Communication, Fine Arts, and Media, UNO Medical Humanities, and the Ted Kuser Center for Health Humanities, particularly our departments of Sociology and Anthropology and our Department of History. Brandy's a medical historian by background, among other things. Special welcome to our UNMC colleagues, students, Nebraska medicine colleagues and students. So glad that you're here. We are going to record this event for colleagues and others. So hearing no nays, I'll ask Dr. Schlosser to do that. Thank you very much. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Schlosser, who will then introduce our very special guest. Dr. Allison Schlosser is an assistant professor of sociology and anthropology and a member of UNO's Medical Humanities faculty. Her research and teaching focuses on cultural studies of addiction, lived experience of problematic drug use and its treatment, and bioethics in relation to access to and quality of healthcare among underserved populations. Dr. Schlosser will be our moderator today, and I'll hand off to you, Allison.
Thank you, Steve. As Steve said, we're thrilled to host Brandy Schillace with us. We wish it could be in person, but this will have to do. Brandy is a medical historian, as Steve said, and also the editor-in-chief of the British medical journal, Medical Humanities Journal. She previously worked in research and public engagement at the Dietrich Medical History Museum in Cleveland, Ohio, and is also the critically acclaimed author of several books, including Death's Summer Coat, What the History of Death and Dying Teach Us About Life and Living, as well as Clockwork Futures, The Science of Steampunk, and the Reinvention of the Modern World. Her most recent book that we'll be discussing today is Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher, A Monkey's Head, The Pope's Neuroscientist, and The Quest to Transplant the Soul, which is an intriguing title, I think. It was described as, quote, one of the most fascinating and largely forgotten sagas in the history of medicine by the New York Times bestselling author Luke Dietrich, and I couldn't agree more. Brandy is also a 2018 winner of the Alfred P. Sloan Science Foundation Award and has also appeared on the Travel Channel's Mysteries at the Museum and NPR's Here and Now, and has bylines in Scientific American, the Globe and Mail, Huffington Post, Slate, and Crime Reads, so she has quite a range. Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher tells a fascinating story that we'll talk about today about one doctor's quest to transplant what he sees as the soul. And along the way, as we follow this quest, we see how the world's first successful primate head transplant shaped technologies that save lives to this day. The book was recently reviewed by the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. So you can check those out. And so welcome, Brandy. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. Sorry I can't see you all in person, but this is a wonderful thing that we can still do this. And I'm really happy that I can join you.
Thank you. And one of the things that I thought was so compelling about your book that I think is a good place to start is how you really take the reader along with you on the quest as you research and come to understand Dr. Robert White and his quest to transplant the human soul. And it really all starts with this old tattered shoebox. So I wonder if you could start with your introduction to Dr. White through this shoebox.
Absolutely. So I'm really happy to report that I have something of an intriguing origin story for this book. So Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher, here it is. But essentially, I was pursued by this story. So for those of you who are joining who aren't familiar with the book, there's a surgeon in Cleveland who did some pretty unusual experiments. And I'm going to basically share with you how I heard about it the first time. So this is also how you might be hearing about it the first time. I got a phone call from a friend of mine who's a neuroscientist and a neurosurgeon, because I happen to have done a book on death and dying, and I'd done a lot of research on brain death and things of that nature, and I got to know him. He called me one day and asked me to come down to his office, which I did on Case Western's campus, Case Western University in Cleveland. And once I got seated, he shuts the door, he sits down, he reaches into the bottom drawer of this filing cabinet, and he pulls out a shoebox. And I'm not expecting a shoebox. I don't know why, of all the things, right? And he says it's tattered, it's old, it's shoebox sitting on this desk. And he just sort of slides it towards me. And I made some kind of offhand comment like, it's not a brain, right? Because he's a neurosurgeon. And he said, well, not exactly. So I open the lid, I pull out this notebook, and the notebook it's old. I can tell it's old. It's probably from the 50s, maybe the 60s. It's like the kind you would use when you're a student and you've got labs. So I start flipping through it, and it's just packed full of this very tiny, cramped writing. There's things pasted in. There's a lot of things about mouse brains, and there's these little rusty flecks. And I asked the neurosurgeon, I was like, what's all what's all this rust? He goes, oh, it's probably mouse blood. Okay, so why? Why are you handing me this book? He says, well, Dr. Robert White performed the first successful head transplant. And there's several words in there that are kind of, that hit you in the head transplant and successful together in the same sentence. And then he says, in 1970, and I just went, what? Nobody knows about this. He performed it not on mice, but on primates. And he had a vision about performing it on human beings. And I thought that makes no sense at all to me. But it turns out Dr. White was a real person, and he was later nominated for a Nobel Prize. He invented techniques we use in surgery still today. He was friends with two different Catholic popes. I guess there is only one kind of pope. Two different popes, Pope Paul VI and Pope John Paul II, who he considered a friend. He helped set up the Vatican Council for Bioethics. He helped to determine parts of the brain death debate. He was involved in a lot of that. He was engaged in a scientific inner space race with the Soviet Union, with somebody he was basically attempting to beat to the punch, so to speak. It was a Russian colleague. And he took heads off of things. This is just a lot of stuff coming at a person sitting across the desk from a neurosurgeon all at once. And the question was, do you think that you might want to write about this person? And of course, I'm like, yes, of course I want to write it. How can this possibly be true? So that was my introduction to this story. And the curious thing about the biography of Dr. Robert White is that it's more than just a biography. It's not just about his life. It's this cross-section of this strange time when we were first learning how to transplant organs for the first time. And I think we accept that so readily, we don't realize how weird it was when people were like, I'm just going to take your heart and put it over there. It'll be fine. These were things that were new and strange, and we weren't really sure where the boundaries of medicine was, but more specifically, we kind of got there technologically before our ethics quite caught up too. So there's a lot of questions to ask during this time period about what's right and the difference between can and should. But as far as Dr. Robert White goes, everything that I had heard rumored about him, it wasn't just true, there was more. Like, it was just bigger and stranger and more interesting, fascinating, and awe-inspiring, and a little scary than I ever expected it to be on that day in the doctor's office. Yeah,
and you really bring life to Dr. White himself and how his personality and his public persona all shaped this research and his reception, but also that's very deeply connected to the things that you mentioned, the politics of the Cold War, ethics of using animals in research and human rights. And this was over the course of a very long period of time where there were many shifts in these things. One of the things that I thought was especially compelling about this book was how you get a real sense of Dr. White himself, and yet it's so holistically portrayed within these different contexts. Can you talk about how you approached researching the book in order to present him in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. So White, I should mention, I am in Cleveland. Dr. White was in Cleveland. The head transplant took place in Cleveland. If you're from Cleveland, some of this you'll just go, yeah, that makes sense. But White in Cleveland is a celebrity. So when I started telling people that I was working on a book on Dr. Robert White, I got these kinds of responses. Oh, he was on that one television show in town, that local show, Big Chuck and Little John. Oh, he saved my cousin. Oh, my uncle learned to walk again because of him. Oh, he saved my little sister from cancer. There was nobody I talked to who had never heard of him in Cleveland. So in terms of how you explore a life, it was almost like I had more information than I knew what to do with, rather than not enough. I interviewed people who loved him, and I interviewed people who hated him. And I feel, I know the title is a bit squirrely, and people actually have mistakenly thought it was fiction at first. When my editor originally presented it to the board at Simon & Schuster, they were like, well, we don't do fiction in this department. And she's like, no, it's real. But there's a reason. Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher are two names that actually were nicknames that Dr. Robert White had. Now, he gave himself the name Mr. Humble, and I feel like if you call yourself Mr. Humble, you're communicating something that might not be humility. It might be a little tongue-in-cheek. And he was called Dr. Butcher by animal rights organizations who were really appalled at the kinds of experiments that he was doing, and at the time he was doing them. But it's a good title for another reason. It is intentionally hearkening back to stories like, Jekyll and Hyde. Because White is a complicated individual. On one hand, he's deeply Catholic, very rich, very religious, very spiritual. He has 10 children. He saves people from cancer. He's friends with the Pope. On the other hand, he goes toe-to-toe with PETA. I've watched debates of him just eviscerating his opponents. He deeply believed that he was right and that what he was doing was accurate. He pushed science in all these, ways that were, at the time, even really groundbreaking. He had a lot of, there was a lot to Dr. White, right? Ego-wise, he was a big personality and he had big ideas and he didn't really suffer fools. And so you have these two competing impulses, and at times he seems very heroic. And at times he seems almost villainous or anti-heroic anyway. And to me, to capture all of that meant I had to really not just interview people, but read his works, find out more about where he practiced and when and why, because of course, there's things that we accept today that we might not have accepted back then, and the reverse. There's things that, certain kinds of behaviors, everybody just was like, yeah, that's fine. This is before, he literally is working before and during the civil rights movement. He's working before and after animal rights movements. So this is a fascinating period of time. Like, we went through so much change so quickly. And so really, you can't know Dr. White unless you know what it would be like to practicing medicine 1950, 1960, 1970, 1980, when the wall comes down, right? All of these things filter in, especially because he was a totally international figure. In addition to going to Rome to hang out with the Pope, he was intentionally, he met with and had a rivalry with another doctor named Vladimir Demikhov in the Soviet Union, who was responsible for creating a surgically two-headed dog. So these things are all just happening in this time period in ways that I think now seem mind-blowing to us. But that's because we've moved so far from it,
One of the things that I think is so interesting about Dr. White in terms of the complexity of his personality and his motivations is his Catholicism, and how that informed his idea of what it meant to transplant a soul and where the soul resides. Can you talk about how his Catholicism informed the work?
I absolutely can. I want to actually talk about a little bit, one other thing first, because I feel like you almost need this back history for that to really make sense. And I know we have a picture of Robert White and Vladimir Demikhov here somewhere. When White was a medical student, he was basically a medical student in Boston. That's the jaunty looking seated fellow in the suit there. That's Dr. Robert White. And his opponent in Soviet Union, that's Vladimir Demikhov on the other side. But when White was that age, in that photograph, he was basically a medical student in Boston at the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital there. And if you don't know the history, you might nonetheless feel like that hospital, like maybe that sounds familiar. There's someone named Dr. Murray, his name might sound familiar. The very first successful kidney transplant took place in this time period. And so essentially what you have is, whoa, sorry, I disappeared for a second there. I apologize. I touched something and I shouldn't have. What you basically have is they're removing a kidney and putting it into another person's body. And that sounds pretty usual to most of us, probably. But it would have been quite shocking back then. You can pull that down now. We'll come back to it in a little bit. But when you take the kidney out of a body and you put it somewhere else, we do that. Doesn't that sound normal? Of course it does. It never worked before because your body rejects it. This is before anti-rejection drugs. This is before we understood the immune response. But if you are working with identical twins, then the body doesn't know not to reject the organ. So the first successful kidney transplant takes place in the Herrick twins. And one twin gives his kidney to the other twin. They perform this. Dr. Murray happened to be the doctor that, Dr. White was in this coterie of people at this time. He's a student, he's a medical student, and he said to himself, if we can remove a kidney and put it somewhere else, well, that means we could remove hearts and lungs too. This hadn't been done yet. And that means you could technically remove all the organs at one time and just move the entire body over to a head that had a body that was failing. And I bring this up because for Dr. White, the brain and the soul are the same. He's Catholic. He believes everybody has a soul. Every human has a soul. And he believes that soul must live in your brain. And in fact, he comes up with a really peculiar and interesting theory called the White Principle, Mr. Humble, that is about the fourth dimensional soul. He believes that the soul exists in 4 dimensions and that the dimension where it touches our physical dimension is in the brain. It's very complicated, but he believes this, and he thinks that means any brain is a human soul and any soul is worth saving. And as a result, anything you do to save that soul is worthwhile. If your body is riddled with cancer and dying, why not just get a new body and transfer it over here? This is something he was thinking about in the 50s. But of course, that sounds pretty pie in the sky. Then in 1958, he sees a grainy black and white footage, basically a movie footage of a dog, very large dog body, but it has 2 heads. And it was surgically created by this Dr. Vladimir Demikov was a physiologist, and he had created this animal to prove that you could transplant a head. So now it's 1958, so we've had the successful surgery. White's already thinking body transplants. He sees this and he's like, oh, if the Russians can do it, so can I. So he was really moved by that. So I wanted to point that out because he's deeply motivated by his sense of an immortal soul, which he very much carries with him from a Catholic perspective. But he's also motivated by this competitive desire to sort of win at something and to show that this is possible. And he wants the United States to win. And I think if you didn't live through it, it's harder to understand. But I know my grandparents and my parents even were just like, yes, America must win, like the United States must win. And so even the federal government and the funds that would follow after these experiments were very much like, oh, we can't let the Soviet Union get there first. So when Dr. White starts thinking, I need to start experimenting with whether or not a brain or head can outlive its body, its original body, there was actual money and funding available for things like this. And I think that's sometimes hard for us to understand, that I think we'd be far less okay with it now than they were then. So there was this race to see who was going to achieve this first. And there's this real sense in which White's Catholicism and his beliefs and his spirituality lent a kind of higher power to him. He felt like he had a higher mission to discover these things, while also this competitive drive. Again, he's kind of got these 2 sides to achieve this.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating how he so clearly locates the soul and consciousness in the brain. And I wondered how he thought, if at all, about the role of the body for identity and consciousness and experience.
Yeah, now I find this fascinating because for White was definitely very much a sort of Cartesian dualist. To him, you're just a brain with legs. Like he did not really, um, it's not that I think he didn't think the body was important, but to him, it was all mind. Your mind was what mattered. And he really felt that your consciousness would be the same if it was transplanted somewhere else. And I would love to return to this again towards the end of our talk when we open up to questions, because I'm not sure I agree with him at all about that. I do think our bodies are very important, but this was, for him, he just felt this is the only thing that matters. So much so that there's a couple of really interesting anecdotes where he worked in a trauma hospital. So he was a neurosurgeon and a neuroscientist, so an MD and a PhD. And he worked at a trauma hospital, Metro General here in Cleveland. He saw a lot of horrible things, car accidents and cancer and gunshot wounds and all sorts of things where people were rendered paralyzed. One of the anecdotes was a young man who was a soccer player, and he had been playing soccer and they were building a little celebratory pyramid after winning, and he fell off the top and broke his neck. He's rushed to the hospital and he keeps saying while he's in ICU, someone just kill me, I just want to die. I'll never play soccer again, my life's not worth living. And one of the residency doctors said he was sort of like, sympathetic to that. And he said to Dr. White, I feel so bad that he can't have what he wants, that he can't just die. And Dr. White was like, no, death is never the answer. The brain matters. If the brain is alive, then it's worth living. And Dr. White was ultimately proved right in this case. A few years later, the patient comes back. He's still tetraplegic, but he has a very full life. He's married, he has kids, he has a life. And so for Dr. White, that was very, it validated his sense that brain was really where it was at. The body was just, he really talked about bodies like these were just support systems. This is just a life support system for who you were in his mind. I don't necessarily know that I agree. But he comes to this in part because of his brain isolation experiments. And this is really a critical one because I know head transplant, I'm getting there, I promise. Head transplant is wild, but to me, it's not the weirdest thing I read. It's not the strangest thing I found out about. Brains. If I asked all of you to just imagine a brain for a minute, you can, right? You just close your eyes, you see a brain, it's sort of shaped like a walnut. It just looks like a nice thing, clinical and sterile. But what if you wanted that brain to still be alive after you took it out? So how do we do that? How does that happen? Well, the brain's super greedy. It's a very greedy organ. It has lots of oxygen, lots of blood. And if you stall that even just a little bit, you get brain damage. So White wanted to find out if you could actually isolate a brain outside of its body and keep it alive. And he invented a couple of techniques to help him do that, including a way of using hypothermia therapeutically so that the brain wasn't so greedy for oxygen. We still use this today. As a matter of fact, my dad just had open heart surgery and they used perfusion so that he wouldn't suffer brain damage while they were, stopping the heart to do all of this work in his chest. So if you think about it, it's kind of amazing that something that Dr. White developed for a somewhat strange experiment is something we still use. But he cools the brain down and then he wants to isolate it. But you have to cut the body off of it. So you still have to feed it with blood and then you have to take the body away. Now, how do you do that? So he got a much larger a larger life support system, and he plugged it in. So he would slowly start unplumbing the brain from the body it was in and replumbing it with the other stuff from this body, the blood from this body, until he got it all hooked up. And then he would just cut the rest of the body off. So now you just have a head. And then he put the head in this little stand and they'd go about like cutting the face off and and it's really, and I did actually tone this down in the writing because I decided if I just gave it to you straight, it would just be a little too much. And actually I do have a picture, but I didn't put the really scary picture. I put a drawing of it instead, which I think is easier to look at. So if we want to draw that up really quickly. Once you get that naked brain, oops, next one. There we go. So that's the two-headed dog on one side of Vladimir Demikov. And on the other side is this, a drawing of how this would work out. And doesn't that just look nice and sterile and clean? And there's nothing upsetting about it. But in fact, it's pretty upsetting how you get there. So we can he can bring it back to me now, but the brain, once he had isolated it, he hooked it up to little electrodes, and the electrodes are fed to an EEG. And so now this is a brain, no body, just sitting there, just a brain. And it's feeding information to the EEG, and it's just clipping along. It's clearly still in there. It's alive, it's metabolizing, it's using oxygen, and it's blipping the little I'm thinking about stuff graph. And I don't know what I was thinking about, probably like, because I don't have a body. But because it doesn't have a lot of stimulus, nothing's coming in, there's no sound, there's no sight, but it's a living brain. This is a brain outside of a body, and it's alive. And I hope I hope your mind explodes about this the way mine does, because I just couldn't believe that that was a thing you could do. And secondly, why would you want to do that? It turns out there are some reasons. He was trying to isolate the brain because he thought that if you did that, you could study it. How does it interact with drugs? How does it metabolize outside of the body's system, interrupting and interfering? So, okay, that's interesting. He also wanted to do it because he thought, what if you could put a brain in cold storage and like hang on to it for a while alive, maybe indefinitely? I know this sounds a little bit like cryonics, right? Because it is a little bit like that. It's this idea that you can put a self in stasis. But most particularly, this gets back to that concept of soul. Dr. White had essentially proved that your brain could outlive your body, and because he felt that the brain and the soul were the same thing, it was tantamount to proving that there was an immortal soul. And for him, this was a very important thing. So all of that is happening. He actually, it's very well received. Many people are really excited about the isolation experiment, and they're like, oh, this will really help us learn things about the brain and its vascular system. But they didn't necessarily believe it was still thinking. A lot of his colleagues were like, you don't know what those lines mean. You don't know that it's really still in there. So White goes back to the drawing board. How can I prove that that monkey is the same monkey, even though it's outside of its own head? No, outside of its own body. It gets complicated to talk about, actually. But he wanted to prove that it was still in there. And this goes back to Demikov. He noted that Demikov just took the whole head and put it on the other dog. And of course, that meant both dogs could look at you, they could raise their ears, they could stick their tongues out, they could lick you, they could lap up milk, and you could prove that that head was being supported on this other body, and therefore that head was technically had outlived its previous body. Demikovs were almost more like, they weren't exactly a head transplant. He actually used almost a part of the upper body, and so the front limbs of the dog were also attached to the larger dog. White wanted to do just the head, and so he begins researching, how can I move one monkey's head onto another monkey's body so that it can wake up, so I can show you, I can demonstrate that it can hear, it can see, it can gnash its teeth, it can eat, it can do all of these other things. So that becomes his next real, like what he really wants to do. But of course, that upsets people, as it probably should, partly because when you cut here and you remove the head, you're also creating, you're severing the spinal cord. And we do not yet, still, even today, have a means of doing anything about that if that happens. You cannot replumb your spinal cord. So whatever you've done to take that head off, you end up with a tetraplegic creature on the other side, even if it lives. And it does live. The monkey experiment works in 1970. He actually did it several times, but the one lived for 9 days total, and he takes this monkey's head and he puts it on a new body. It's a long and complicated experiment, actually. I describe it some length in the book. And he waits. And there's video footage of this, which I've seen, and he smoked a pipe, so he's just like smoking furiously, waiting for this in the surgery room. I know, different time period, smoking furiously, waiting for this monkey to wake up. And it does. And it is a very unhappy monkey. It's angry, it tries to bite him, it's furious, and he's like very excited. Like, this is proof that this was the same monkey, because the monkey sort of hated him before as well, as I think you might do if you were an experimental creature in one of his labs. But he was very thrilled about this. He thought he'd really done something amazing. What he had also done was just set himself into a lot of trouble, because people wanted to know why you were doing this to animals. Like, what's the point? if you're not planning to do this on a human being, why would you be doing this to monkeys? What possible utility could there be? And he begins to clash very much with animal rights activist groups at about that time, including some PETA definitely, but also some of the more fringe groups who were somewhat more dangerous.
And so you've written about how Dr. White was willing to debate people within the animal rights community in public fora like the City Club of Cleveland.
Mm-hmm.
What do we know about how he thought about the use of animals in these experiments through those conversations?
Yeah, he was very, very clear about how he thought about it. He believed all animal rights people were just wrong. He just thought that he thought that it was right for you to want animals to not be like tortured. But he didn't consider anything he was doing to be torturous to animals. And he thought it was right that the animal should be kept well and fed well up until such time as it might be used for an experiment. But he just thought they were wrong. He said, animal rights activists are standing in the way of science. They are, he basically, he was very good at rhetoric, by the way. He was phenomenal at this. He was really good at it. And so he would hold up images of like a child that he had saved, and then hold up a picture of a rat and be like, which one do you care about? And he would just say, like, don't you want me to perform these experiments to save your daughter? Well, obviously most people say yes. And so he used that to his advantage to say, I'm right, you're wrong. He also felt very convinced that he was doing God's work. He felt that God was behind what he was doing, and he didn't think animals had souls. He does get into a little bit of a rhetorical corner at one point, because after the monkey head experiment, he said he was interviewed by a journalist named Oriana Felici, who's very interesting herself. And he said, by successfully doing this, I have shown that you can transplant a soul. And then the rejoinder was, I thought you said animals didn't have souls. So then he had to be like, well, they don't. What I meant was, so you can understand that, for him, animal rights groups were going to just get in the way of science, and we weren't going to find cures for anything. And he used to bring things up like vaccines, which lots of times have been used, experiments had happened on animals first. So he was very adamant that this was the right way. But he also kind of didn't play games. So when he went to the City Club, he debated Ingrid Newkirk, and I interviewed her about this. She's the founder of PETA. When he went to debate her at the City Club, he actually had like some plants in the audience. So he had some people whose lives he'd saved in the audience. So when he got to the point about, what do you care more about? There were literally people that could stand up and be like, I'm still here because of this. So, he was very good at it. The animal rights groups had a point, though. They weren't wrong. White had not violated any rules for how you treat animals at the time, but we actually treat animals a lot better for experiments now than they ever did. The animals didn't have much enrichment. If you were an experimental animal, you were kept in a small cage. There wasn't like playtime. Now, even animals that are, even different primates that are kept for experiment have enrichment activities. It's almost more like a zoo where they get exercise and all these other things. And we have, animal rights activism is partly to thank for some of those rules, even if they feel like the rules haven't gone far enough. People who are with PETA feel like there should be no experimentation, but they did actually push the needle a little bit so that some of those conditions got better. White was having none of it, though. He just thought they were just wrong, and he went to his grave feeling that way too.
Yeah, that was my question. Did his beliefs shift at all with this?
I don't think his beliefs ever shifted at all about much anything. He really felt like he was doing the right thing, and I kind of understand why. He was, in fact, saving a lot of lives. He was inventing experiments that were saving lives, and I can see how you would come to feel like you were definitely on the right side of history. Not everybody is going to feel that way about you, and in fact, the transplant science is rife with this kind of tension, because you had a lot of race tension happening. This is a civil rights movement, and one of the early heart transplants was a Black man's heart in South Africa went into a white man's body, and the newspapers said things like, oh, look, now his heart can go places his body wasn't allowed because there was apartheid. So there's a whole lot of tensions that I think, it's not that they didn't it's not that White wasn't aware of them, but his focus was so driven and narrow in this very specific way that it wasn't always a part of his wider scope, I think.
One of the things I've wondered about, and you brought up the case in South Africa of a Black African man having his heart transplanted to a white man. This was during the time of apartheid. How much White thought about the potential for medical discrimination, for misuse of these practices as he was focused on developing them.
He actually, for the time period, he was pretty progressive. He intentionally hired, his team was the most diverse team at Metro. Like he had, Asian American, African American, all sorts of Hispanic American people on his team. Javier Vidura was like his right-hand man and really responsible for a lot of the surgery. So he was quite progressive in terms of racial and cultural factors. He was probably a little less I don't think there were any, he did have nurses, but I don't think that there were that many women's surgeons that he was working with necessarily, but he was progressive for the time period in which he lived. It's just that, time keeps moving and things keep changing, and the world changed around him in a lot of ways. And so some of the things that we might call hubris now, right? His sense of ego, his big personality really helped him early in his career and was like, yes, in the 60s, all right, good, doctor, go. Later in his life was actually looked back on as people were uncomfortable with it. His sense that you didn't question it, you just did it, was lauded at one point in time, and then later people are kind of going, oh, I don't like this. He didn't give up. He didn't give up his dream, not just to transplant like primate heads, but he wanted to perform the surgery on human beings. He even had a volunteer patient named Craig Vidovitz, who was volunteering for the surgery. He was a tetraplegic patient. His kidneys were starting to give out, and he was willing to go through and see if the surgery could extend his life. So, when he brought it up the second time, like, hey, let's do this, you had a lot different world that you're working with now. And everybody's kind of going, we don't think that's a good idea now. And I think that he felt that some of that was due to the fact that we no longer were in a race with the Cold War. We're no longer in a race with the Soviet Union, I mean. But I think there's a lot more factors to it. I think the world has just changed. Ethics have changed. Things have broadened out, and we look at things very differently than we did.
Yeah, I think one of the fascinating things about this story, when we think about medical ethics and the technologies that we have at our disposal, is this question that you raise of just because we can do something, should we do it? And it's kind of mind-blowing to me that this could actually be done, and White did identify his perfect patient.
Yeah. Yeah, like right now, I couldn't do it, but I mean, technically we could do it. Someone's head could be taken off and put on another body and rehooked up, and you could live through that. Technologically, it's possible. But you have to ask a lot of questions about why it would be worth doing. For one thing, success rates in early transplants are not great, right? The first heart transplant patients lived days to weeks to maybe a month or two, right? This wasn't necessarily a high success rate, even when it was successful. But secondly, some of the pushback has to do with if you have to have a body to work with. It's not just the patient saying, sure, I'm willing to take a body. You have to give them a body. It has to come from somewhere. You can't, so they're not lying around. Well, they are lying around, actually. That was sort of the point. In White's purview, there are brain dead patients in hospitals that are never going to wake up, and they could be harvested for this technology. But that means you all have to agree on what brain death is, and that brain death is real death. And that means we all have to come to a conclusion about that. And that was by no means assured in this time period, particularly in the 60s, when heart transplants were going forward. We did not have a definition of when death was. We knew what was dead and we knew what was alive, but that middle bit was very ambiguous. And it kind of still is. There are legal definitions, but there's not a single, everyone agrees on it, medical definition of the moment of death. So what that means is, legally, you could be declared alive in one country and dead in another because it's a legal definition. It does allow for us to declare someone brain dead and then to take the organ, but it's not actually as clear cut as people think. you have to interpret that. You have to go, okay, there's a checklist, right? And part of the checklist is reading the EEG and saying, oh, it's a flatline EEG, there's no activity. But flatline doesn't necessarily mean a completely flat line. Sometimes there can be like the odd blip here and there, and then the surgeon has to determine whether that blip means you're alive or whether that blip is an anomaly. It's very subjective. And this is partly why doctors always ask family members to sort of help them come to a determination about pulling, life support systems away from a patient, because it kind of needs to be a discussion rather than, yep, we know, we're sure. So it's complicated. So you want to perform a head transplant, you can't, first of all, you need permission. Secondly, you need a patient, but you also need a donor. And that's something we have to think about, because if I'm an organ donor and I die, my heart could save one person and my lungs could save someone else and my kidneys to go to someone else. If you give me someone else the entire body, that could have gone to 5 other people. So you also have this question, this ethical bioethics question about who gets organs and how and why and what kinds of lives are worth saving. On the other side, the flip side of that, you have Craig Vidovitz, who said, why is my life not worth saving? I'm alive. I have a full life. Yes, I'll still be paralyzed after the surgery, but I'm paralyzed now. I'm married. I have my own business. I travel. My life should be worth saving too. And if you say it's not, you're being ableist. So there's 2 very distinct and not very clear answers to some of the questions, but it certainly takes the lid off of a whole lot of ethical questions that we don't normally sit around, asking ourselves.
Yeah, and I'm sure, I should say that we are going to be opening it up to question and answer. I'm sure that many of you have questions coming to mind, so please feel free to add them to the chat, and we'll address those as many as we can. One of the things on the idea about using this patient, this perfect patient, Craig Vidovitz, and how he viewed the idea that his life wouldn't be as valuable because he would be paralyzed and continue to be from the neck down, would be ableist. I wondered what Dr. White what kind of conversations he had or would he have now with the disability rights advocates?
I think I actually was just having this conversation with the same neuroscientist who started me on this path yesterday. And I said, I almost feel that White would have accidentally fallen into disability rights because he thought the brain was the most important thing. And because he felt that the body was almost ancillary to this most important thing, any life that still had a mind, he would have considered worthy of saving. So that means he saw all lives as being equal, because he saw any life that had brain activity was equal in his mind. That was an equal human soul, coming back to his Catholicism. So, and he was very adamant about this, and he spoke very, feelingly about this concept that if you're in there, you're okay, you're still there. So in a way, I feel like he supports some of the disability rights stuff, even though I don't know, he comes at it from a very different perspective than I think a lot of people do. I should also mention that White really courted controversy. He wasn't afraid of it at all. He was on the cover of like the Cleveland Free Times, and he went on hard copy, and he's actually one of the inspirations for the second X-Files movie. And I interviewed Frank Spotnitz, who's the creator or producer of X-Files, for this book. He read the book and he blurbed it even, but he basically came up with the idea that a head transplant would happen in X-Files 2, the second movie. And he was doing some research and discovered like, oh my gosh, someone did it. So he got into a jet and he flew to Cleveland to meet Dr. White. So that just gives you a sense that there's even kind of a sci-fi connection. And White was all like, oh, sweet, I get to influence the X-Files movie. Neat. He thought that he dressed up as Frankenstein for Halloween. This is a thing that he actually did. We have photographs of it. So he wasn't afraid of controversy. He wasn't afraid of wading into really murky territory. As a result of his activities, he was actually chased by a mob of people dressed in monkey suits, and one of them threw a plastic human head at him. I mean, this is a guy who was just ready. He just was. And he was also somebody whose perfusion techniques and other surgeries are still useful today and was nominated for a Nobel Prize. So he's all of those things.
I wonder how his engagement with the public in these ways, where he's sort of a showman, affected his reception within the scientific community.
Yeah, well, he thought it would help. And partly he thought this because during the Cold War era, that sort of thing did help. Later in his life, he said he thought later that maybe that was not such a good idea. Maybe he really was worried that it might have been a reason that he might not win the Nobel Prize. We actually don't know if he would have won it. He died the year he was nominated, and they don't give the awards out posthumously. So we don't have any idea how close he was in the running. But yeah, I do think he thought it would be helpful because at a time in our career, that kind of stuff was helpful. He would have loved social media, by the way. I feel like he'd have been on Twitter, you know? There would have been just white tweets everywhere. He actually had his own newspaper column called The White Papers.
Mm. I'm going to get to a few questions that are coming in on the chat. And I should also note that if you'd like to ask your question, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. Bob Barty is asking, how did White define the soul other than it lived in the brain?
So he used a pretty standard Catholic definition, which is also why he didn't believe that animals had souls. He believed that animals had what he called an animating principle. So they lived and they moved, and that was better than, like, say, rocks and trees, but that the human soul was the immortal, immutable, God-directed thumbprint of the divine, basically. I'm way paraphrasing. I do have a quote of his about it where he said one of his friends had died and he had been working on him, and he said, "I held my friend's brain in my hand, but it's just an empty bottle and the perfume has gone." So he also described, he likened the soul to sort of a perfume that gave the bottle meaning in the first place.
And there's a related question from Amelia on Catholicism. She writes, as a Catholic, he must have believed in the immortal life of the soul. How did he justify keeping the head alive in a mortal sense?
You know what? That's a question I had too. And I've never been able, I talk about it some in the book, but as far as I can tell, it's because White felt that as a surgeon, his mission was to keep a brain and body alive with all the technological resources that were possible. And to him, that was his mission. That was his God-directed mission. And that if you were meant to die, you would. And that, you know, that would be God's decision then. He didn't ever want the decision for someone's life or death to rest with human beings. And he felt that, so he was a big proponent for not taking away life support. I mean, he really wanted, it's interesting because unless you were brain dead, if you were brain dead, he was fine. He thought, okay, you're dead, you're gone. But if your brain still had activity of any kind, to him, that meant it was his God-directed mission to make sure that you lived until God was ready to be done with you. So that was kind of the only answer I've ever read. I thought it was curious myself. I thought, oh, wouldn't you want to release the immortal soul? But not Dr. White.
I think we have another related question from Laura Alexander. Laura, would you want to ask your question? Unmute yourself and ask, or should I go ahead?
Yes, that would be fine. I know it's kind of a long question. It just has to do with the sort of what I understand to be kind of the most, kind of the latest, or what have you, kind of understanding of the way that the brain and the body interact with each other. Mm-hmm. Mostly around the issue of consciousness, that there seem to be ways in which, again, this is not my field, but the neurosciences can track consciousness that actually seems to, in some sense, live in the cells of the body, for, you know, to use sort of imprecise language. So what I was asking here is, if in fact some kind of a head or brain transplant were successful, it sounds like Dr. White may have been wrong about the way that that would go, like what would happen afterwards. He seemed to think that whoever's brain or head it was would basically live on in that body. And what I'm saying is that based on what we seem to know about consciousness and potentially thought, and again, of course, you know, whether one says soul depends on one's kind of background and one's like understanding of the human being. It seems like you would end up with a new person, basically. If you had one body and another brain that had not previously been attached to each other, you would end up with a new person.
You probably wouldn't immediately, but I thought of that too, because I was thinking, you know, I have an autoimmune disease, and frankly, it's part of who I am at this point. I don't even understand myself outside of that. And so if I had a body that didn't have that, I would not be the same. But to take it from another route, I do a lot with LGBT community and with the journal. And I was thinking about the trans community where they talk about the fact that, you know, the body, the way your body is and how you identify is incredibly important. And we're learning that it's so important that it actually can cause dysphoria and other real problems happening, you know, if you don't address it. So if you think about it that way, your physical self and your mental self are like deeply intrinsically related. And that's even beyond like what we know is exactly happening at cellular and genetic levels. We're still like CRISPR is just, we just don't understand exactly how genetics work. What happens when you stick a head with one set of genes into a body with another set of genes? You know, what goes on there? What will happen over time? Maybe, you know, the monkey only lived for 9 days. Maybe in those 9 days, it was essentially the same. But once your body's been interacting with itself and there's new cellular activity, it's hard to say. I think he had a somewhat simplistic view of just how important our bodies really are to who we see ourselves as and how we operate. But on top of that, if you isolated a brain and it had no sensory data, I can't imagine how you would even still be all right in there. You know, if you couldn't see and you couldn't hear and you couldn't taste, and there was literally no sensory deprivation. You know, we know that sensory deprivation causes deeply psychological issues. It's hard to say what you would be like on the other side of that. So I agree with you. I think he was very oversimplifying the relationship between the body and brain. But it's still very strange to me that we could. The way to find it out would be to do one, and we probably shouldn't. Let me know we shouldn't.
Thanks for your question, Laura. There's another question from Amelia. It's, were EEGs ever done on the dogs? If so, prior and post-operation?
So the dogs were actually, the ones in the Soviet Union, no. They were up and barking and stuff, and so they were still around, but no EEGs were done there. However, White did do an experiment on dogs where he took the brain of one dog and he took it completely out, living brain, just like I was explaining the isolated brain. He did that with a dog and he stuck it inside the neck cavity of another dog. So the neck cavity was feeding it, so the other dog could be closed up and walk around and be okay. And they listened, they had an EEG attached to that brain that was just living inside the dog's neck. And it was also registering, like it could hear things and it could process certain kinds of stimuli. So that one, yes, but not the Soviet Union they were struggling at that time and they didn't have a lot of the same technological abilities that we had over here.
One of the things I was really curious about reading your book towards the end, where White is towards the end of his career and he's still going for this head or body transplant, which is the language he used, which he switched back and forth, which was also—
He did switch back and forth.
But you talk about brain gate towards the end and new advances in technologies that can subvert the spinal cord in order to connect brain activity to muscles and new technologies in that vein. Was White in conversation with people developing those technologies? And what would you think?
He wasn't. He did know about them. He had retired at that point. And so I think at that point, he had realized that probably he wasn't going to be allowed to do the surgery. This is just post the Vidovitz situation where they weren't permitted to go forward with that. And he did know about it. He wrote about it in one of his newspaper columns, but at that point he had been kind of set apart from the rest of the scientific world. And he was quite sad about that. He didn't want to retire. He would have probably just kept on going if they had let him, at least until he got quite ill towards the end of his life. Brain gate's really fascinating, by the way, though. It really is. If you guys aren't familiar with it, it's one of several different places that are doing what is called closing the loop or attempting to close the loop. And it means an attempt to figure out how to get the mind and the body and muscles to communicate, which sounds, I think we have this very simple, yeah, right? You just tell this to over there, like a wireless toy. It doesn't work like that. It's much more complicated than that. And the amount of stimulation you have to do to the brain just to get you to like move a shoulder is pretty impressive. So they are still working on it, but the concept being, if we can't repair a spinal cord, we might be able to jump the gap at some point and have your brain speak directly to your limbs.
I wondered what White would think about pursuing that type of research.
I don't think he probably would. He was so much more invested. He thought that the brain, well, first of all, he didn't necessarily think that paralysis was an end game. But secondly, he was so deeply invested in what the brain itself could do, what was in it. He called it the final frontier. He thought it was more interesting than space. He did express some interest in what in the concept of brain glue, spinal cord polyethylene glycol, or PEG, which is something that they have been trying to use to see if they can seal off stave off certain amounts of paralysis. It doesn't regrow your spinal cord, though there are people investigating that too with stem cells and things. So it's hard to know where we're going next, but I think it's much more likely that we'll get to a place that helps us get rid of paralysis before we ever come to a point where, we're transplanting our heads.
One of the things that you've written about in the past, I'm thinking about Clockwork Futures, is this idea of dread tech. And I was wondering your thoughts on kind of what keeps you up at night when you think about the uses of medical technologies and these types of efforts in the future.
I think that we all have the real tendency to let technology take us places that our ethics have not yet prepared us to go. And for me, one of the great values of science fiction is that it allows us to sometimes test those theories a little bit in a space where it's safe, where we can investigate, well, what if you did do this? What would be the impact on the world? Well, what if you were able to make this change? What would happen then? What if you could extend life for hundreds of years? What would happen if you could do that? And what would be the result? There's even a weird parallel with the Marvel movies, the one where they get rid of everybody and then they bring them all back 5 years later. What happens if you suddenly turn up again 5 years later? It's a way of expressing our anxieties about where science can take us and whether or not we're ready and prepared to go there. And I will say this for Dr. White, despite everything that he wanted to do and achieve, one of the things he always said was that we need to get the ethics there first. Because people asked him, they said, well, if we can do this, do you think we should? And his response, again, proving that he was a brilliant rhetorician, was, that's what bioethics should tell us. So, bioethics needs to get out there and let us know what's right before we, I am merely a humble surgeon. Bioethics has to tell me. So yeah. What keeps me up at night? There's no individual technology that worries me. What worries me is how we are frequently very pleased with results and we don't ask how we got them.
Yeah, I wonder how animal rights activists would, respond to White's work now, thinking of that process and weighing, and how people in general would think about weighing the use of animals. And as you said, the many ways that they're used in the process of medical advancement and discoveries.
Yeah. I know how Ingrid Newkirk responds. She still finds him quite horrific, and she still thinks that his surgeries were unnecessary and brutal. But she's also not really in favor of animal experimentation at all. Very anti-vivisection and things like that. Her reasoning is not illogical, but it does require you to decide which lives matter more than other lives. And we're always doing that, even when we might not realize it. We're always asking ourselves which lives are worth more. And I think that's a question that we don't realize we're asking sometimes. We don't realize whose hands have we put that in. Who decides which lives are worth more than other lives, and if we aren't sure who's answering that question, then there's probably there's an issue. So I don't necessarily come down on the for or against specifically, but I think if we're willing to abdicate the responsibility of determining which lives matter to anyone, to governments, to medical systems, to doctors, to lawyers, that's problematic. We have to be part of that conversation, or else decisions are going to be made for us that we may not like.
I want to go back to a question that has to do with ethics in relationship to the Catholic Church that Laura raised. And that is about his friendship with the popes. But were the popes and or members of the Catholic hierarchy in favor of his work?
So that's a great story. I am slightly moving myself because the sun has found me. I don't know if y'all can tell. And I can't see. Aha, that's better. Really hilariously, he did manage to ask the Pope about brain death and about, hey, we should be able to harvest these bodies, right? That should be a thing that we can do. And the Pope's answer, I can only give you the answer that White said, right? So White said the Pope basically put it back on him and said, well, that's your job. That's what physicians do. Physicians tell us when these surgeries are okay and when they're not. And so White basically took that as like, it's my job. Okay. And he felt like that was enough. I don't think he asked the question again after that. I don't think that's the final word from the Catholic Church, though they did weigh in on the brain death debates and they were part of a big commission. And essentially their ultimate decision, I hope I don't get the language wrong, but was no extraordinary means need to be taken to preserve a perishing body. Because I didn't say this earlier, but you have an autonomic system, and with brain death, your heart will still beat, but your lungs won't work. So usually a brain dead patient has to be artificially respirated. And essentially the Catholic Church was saying artificial respiration is an extraordinary means, and we don't require extraordinary means to keep a body alive, which basically means if you turn off the respirator, the body will die. Long answer, sorry.
I wanted to take a minute to see if there are other questions, and again, invite you to unmute yourself and ask if you would like to do that. I was wondering, as you recently released the book and are getting all sorts of feedback and responses to it, have there been any surprising responses to it?
I received an email from somebody who asked me if I could teach them how to transplant a head. That was a surprising response I wasn't expecting. Yeah, that was the most surprising response, I think. You'll find this, I think, when you read the book. I really am asking you as the reader to investigate these things, and I'm asking you to look at hard questions rather than coming down on any one side. So I haven't received like a lot of pushback necessarily. In fact, I sent a copy to Ingrid Newkirk, a signed copy to Ingrid Newkirk. So, I haven't made too many enemies along the way, but White really did. And I know that it's hard to know exactly how to talk about his legacy. He's had a legacy, and the legacy does matter. There are living people who wouldn't be alive, so there's a legacy right there. There's the fact that his perfusion techniques have been built on, and I'm certainly grateful for them since they've been used to save my own dad. At the same time, part of his legacy is also that science can be a pretty pushy place where people actually are treading maybe delicate and dangerous boundaries. And maybe we're not always comfortable with that, but we often accept it if they're successful. And this is true of so many different things. I think about, sorry, this is a little bit off topic, but I think it's related. Recently, the success of what they're called 3-person babies. And it's essentially where you have mitochondrial damage to your DNA and you want to have a baby, but you don't want the baby to have a killing birth defect. They actually take the nucleus of one egg and they use someone else's mitochondrial DNA, and then they fertilize that egg. And it's technically, it wasn't legal in the United States. So the first successful one was a US doctor flew to Mexico to perform it and then flew back after it was successful. And he was not in trouble for that. But what if it hadn't been successful? We tend to accept things that we think are successful. And so if White had managed to pull this off and it was a roaring success, head transplant just might be a thing. But it's not necessarily a good way to, it's not a good idea to perform something and then decide if it's ethical. We really ought to be doing that the other way around.
Linda has a question. Would you say that Dr. White was influential in the 1986 formation of IACUC, the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees?
I don't think he was. I will say that Dr. White felt that his animosity towards and fight with PETA was extremely instrumental in PETA building itself. PETA does not have this memory at all. So to PETA, he was just another guy performing stuff that was problematic. White would probably say, yes, if it wasn't for me, PETA wouldn't even be a thing. But that's not necessarily true. I think in some ways he probably wasn't quite as important as far as that goes, even as he may have envisioned. I do think that, I don't know if you're very familiar with this, I do talk about it in the book, the Silver Spring monkey case, which was a big deal when it happened and was really one of the first things that brought a lot of public attention to animal rights and animal treatment in lab facilities. And so I imagine that was probably more instrumental.
Patricia has a great question. I wonder, would you be willing to unmute and ask your question?
Yes. So throughout this talk, you've been speaking about how the ideas of a soul being in the brain, whether you agree with that or not, but this idea that that's kind of a moment of equality for disability studies and disability activism. But there is a side of disability activism that says that you should not forget the body and embodied being. And I was just wondering if you think that that was actually, at least in part, a response to Dr. White and these ideas of a head transplant.
I don't think it was in a direct response to Dr. White, but I think it could be in response to some of the things that represents, that way of thinking represents. For instance, sideways from this, but I think it has some bearing on your question. If you're privileging the mind, how much mind? So, White was principally talking about people, just because these are the people he dealt with, he was principally talking about people who were of sound mind, right? He used Stephen Hawking a lot as an example of somebody whose body was failing, but whose mind was sharp. But does that mean that you have to have a mind like Stephen Hawking to matter? What happens if you're perfectly healthy, but you have some cognitive disability? Does that make you somehow, does that change the equation in some way? So I think he had his blind spots. I don't think that the push for realizing the importance of the body was caused by Dr. White, but probably was engendered by responses to other people thinking in a similar way about the fact that, the body and its ability to access things and how it operates is really important. It's not, I remember, here's another possible way of looking at it, is like, our bodies are not sexless. They're not, just because someone's disabled doesn't mean that they shouldn't have a full life, sexually, have families, have children, all of these kinds of things. And if you're saying that somehow the body doesn't matter, you're cutting off a huge part of lived experience that isn't really fair. And there's actually quite a bit of a movement behind that too, which I find fascinating. So I don't think White was necessarily himself intentionally involved in disability activism, but I do think that in engaging someone like Craig Vitovitz, who was very pro, like, hey, my life is full, even though, that was critically important. And I would say Craig's voice is important, and it matters. He did a lot of television interviews where he basically got up to say, it's wrong for you to write me off. And I think that is very impacting, to hear somebody with a disability saying, my life matters, it's full, I have this great life, So probably not direct relationship to White, but important all the same.
Other questions?
Seeing a couple things pop up, but I can't read them.
Yeah, so So Douglas asks, with this book's publication after Dr. White's passing, are there questions or research difficulties that you encountered in crafting the story that you wish you could have clarified with him directly?
You know, I was really lucky. He was so prolific. He wrote so much, published and unpublished. People wrote a lot about him, and he loved to give interviews. So there are many, many audio and video interviews with him. So mostly no. I had run into a small roadblock before I discovered that a friend of his from Germany lived with him for 3 months and took a bunch of notes and wrote a book about Dr. White in German. I don't speak or read German, so I had to translate it a sentence at a time, which was super fun and took a long time. But it was really, really revealing. And so the only time that I ran into a hurdle, I actually managed to get over the hurdle, but it did require the purchase of a dictionary and a lot of time with a pencil. That's tenacity for you, I think. I was like, no, I'm almost there. I will read this book in German.
And I think related to that, I wonder, did any family members of Dr. White's read the book?
Yeah, so several of them have. I gave a whole box to his daughter, who keeps the archive of his materials, to hand out. She read it. She really enjoyed it. His granddaughter contacted me out of the blue, and she actually went to one of my events. She really enjoyed it too, and she said it brought back a lot of memories of her grandfather. But probably one of the more moving things is that Craig Vidovitz's son contacted me and was quite moved to read about his dad in print, and so that was really lovely to get that. It makes you feel like, hey, you did something okay.
And what has the reception been of the book in Cleveland? He was such a prominent figure there.
Well, I'll find out in very short order, actually. In fact, you're all invited if you feel like hearing all about this a second time. But in 45 minutes or so, right? What time is it? Look at me trying to read my watch. I'll be joining doing a book talk here in Cleveland at Max Bax on Coventry Road. And I know that many of his children are going to be at that one. So we'll find out. It has been pretty positive. They did a nice write-up in the Plain Dealer. And of course, White himself was featured in the Plain Dealer. I was featured in Wired, and White was featured in Wired. And so there's been some, it's been interesting to see these kind of parallels.
And related to that, Bridget has a question. Did any of Dr. White's children or grandchildren go into science or research?
His granddaughter is a neurosurgery person who's studying right now. So that was really kind of fun. I think she's the only one. None of his 10 children went into the medical field, but some of the grandchildren have done so.
Thinking about Dr. White's legacy, I was thinking about how he was such an active public scientist. And I wonder what you think we can learn from him, both the caution and what's positive about being a public scientist.
Yeah, so I'm obviously quite out there in the public myself, and it's an interesting place to be, right? If you're doing science or you're doing history of science, for one thing, you have to be very careful. You're going to be taken out of context. It's going to happen. And if you court the kinds of controversies that he tended to court and be unafraid of them, that means that you're going to leave yourself open to different kinds of attack too. At the same token, Dr. White has been in so many magazines, Look magazine, Times, and mentioned in the New York Times, and mentioned it, in all of these different places. And that's not necessarily true of a lot of science that gets done. And so you figure coming out from under Joseph Murray, whose successful kidney transplant was very well covered in the media, that's kind of his model. And so that public science certainly can maybe lead to better public understanding, maybe lead to better funding, but it can also turn around and bite you too. I should share a couple of anecdotes probably, because to give you a sense of the showmanship, one of my favorite stories, it's a little bit disturbing story too, but I just want to let you know that everything works out in the end. So don't worry, hang with me. White was trying to convince a local priest friend of his that brain death was real death, and that as long as there was brain activity, you were alive, even if the body looked like you were dead. and that if the brain died, then even if the body was alive, it didn't matter, you were dead. And he chose to do this by inviting the priest to lunch at his lab. When the priest arrived, he walks into the laboratory and there's a dog on the table, on the operating table, that White has frozen up, like really cool, hyper cooled, super cooled, and taken all the blood out. So the blood has been like taken out of this dog and it's over there in a jar, in an apparatus. And the dog is laid out on the table, super cooled. And White has put a picnic blanket over it and is eating his lunch over top of this dog. And, or near it anyways, bizarre. And he asked the priest, is this dog dead? And the priest says, yes. He says, could you perform last rites on this dog? You know, and the priest is kind of very uncomfortable. He's up against the wall. He's not having any of this. And then White finishes his lunch, puts everything away, puts away the picnic blanket, puts all the blood back in the dog, warms it up, wakes the dog up. The dog gets up, walks around the room and leaves. And he says to the priest, I have performed a miracle then. I have risen him like Christ. That's showmanship for you. That's making a point. So a very strange point to make, but it gives you a sense that he courted this sense of the show, the sense of a larger than life personality. The dog was okay afterwards, I found out. So didn't actually hurt the dog. It was a very disturbing story all the same.
And I have to say the book is filled with really fascinating and bizarre anecdotes like that. And I couldn't recommend it more. It's so interesting and well written, and really so important for our understanding of the history of medical progress, and how we can understand that in the context of policy or politics and ethics and shifts over time. I wonder, as we wrap up, what takeaways you hope readers would get from the book?
Takeaways. Well, I think my favorite question to ask through all of this was not just who we are, but where we are. So to get back to one of the questions one of you asked very early on, I'm sorry I forget your name, but about bodies and how they matter in the cellular, at the cellular level, and where your consciousness resides. I think that's a really important question to ask. Not just who am I, but where in this composite body, you know, in this meat jacket, like where in this meat jacket am I living? How am I this person that I am? The philosophical questions for me were almost as equal, were definitely equally as important as the scientific ones, because, you know, and part of this probably comes because I'm a medical humanities professional, but to me, you know, the human and health and bodies and technology, all of these intersections are so important. And when you think about it, the human body itself is a bizarre composite of mechanical things and electrical things and cellular things and, you know, fleshy, squishy bits and bony bits. And here we are also moving in our own skin with this consciousness that we don't completely and fully understand. I'm still me, even when I'm sleeping. Am I me when I wake up? You know, just all kinds of fascinating questions. So in addition to the ethical questions about the cans and the shoulds of science, I hope people come away from this book with a renewed understanding of just how complex and wonderful each individual person really is.
And as I said, I can't recommend the book more. Buy the book. We have some information to share with you on how you can purchase the book from the Dundee Book Company right here in Omaha. Tell your friends and colleagues about it. And yeah, Steve is sharing some information on how you could go online and buy from Dundee Book Company. Thank you so much, Brandy, for joining us and for this really fascinating conversation. And thank you for the work that you do to communicate this interesting science.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. It was fun to write the book. I will tell you that. It was like one of those like Russian dolls. Like I took part off and went, oh, there's more. Oh, there's more. Oh, there's more, to infinity. So I hope all of you enjoy reading it as much as I enjoyed writing it. And I really enjoyed being here with all of you.
Thank you all for joining us.